Good morning, everybody. We'll be getting started in a moment. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. Just waiting for a few more people to be let into the session. Okay, so I think we are good to get started. Alan, if you can move on, please. So thank you for joining us today, where we're going to be talking in the first of our AI series of webinars, where we're going to be talking about developing your AI strategy for not-for-profits, and delighted to have Caroline, a guest speaker from the BMA, joining us today as well. So quickly just move on to some webinar etiquette before we get into the session, to say that this session is being recorded and it will be available on demand after the session, so you can watch back to your heart's content. The Q&A box is for any questions that you have throughout the sessions. We really want this to be as interactive as possible, so please put the questions in there and we'll cover as many as we can. And if there's any that we don't have time for, we will come back to you afterwards. There is also going to be a prize on this webinar for the best question. So Alan's going to tell you a bit more about that prize later on. And if you have any more technical questions, if you use the chat box for that. So Q&A box for questions, and for any of the speakers, and chat box for more technical questions. Thank you, Alan. So I'm Joyce Harman, I'm Head of Client Services at Hart Square, and absolutely delighted to be joined by Carolyn Brown, the Chief Information Officer at the BMA, who has some great insights into some of the work and thinking that the BMA have been doing around artificial intelligence. And as always, delighted to be joined by Alan Perestrello, the Managing Director of Hart Square. So just quickly, a little bit about Hart Square, for those of you who are not aware of us. We are a consultancy practice and only work within the not-for-profit sector. As you can see, there's lots of stats here, but really to say that, we work with lots of clients across a lot of different areas, everything from strategy, selection, benefits realization, and implementation. So Alan, over to you.
Thanks, Joyce. Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. The first in our AI series, and this topic is specifically focused on looking at how to develop your AI strategy within the not-for-profit space. I always think it's useful to set the scene with these, and I thought today I was looking at some content, and I thought this cartoon probably struck a useful chord in terms of how the industry and the hype around AI is probably being used. And I think when I was looking at this, I started to think about, where does this sort of oft-used quote, if everything in the world was a nail, then maybe you'd be looking a bit more to use a hammer a bit more often. And it actually comes from well-known psychiatrist Abraham Maslow, who said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, it is tempting to treat everything as if it were a nail. And I think that's quite true in terms of the current hype around AI. I think we're seeing a lot of opportunities to use AI, but we're also seeing a lot of hyperbole around the use of AI and how it's seen as an ultimate solution to almost all of the world's ails. Now, some of that will be true, and some of that will be hype, and some of that will be just part of the natural, curve of kind of hype adoption within the technology sector. So that got me thinking, is the hype around AI justified? And when I've always thought about technology in terms of its implementation and cycles, and actually these things are very closely related to project implementation life cycles as well, I came across the Gartner hype cycle. Most of you will all know Gartner for their work in terms of benchmarking and categorizing technology. But this is actually a very interesting way of looking at it. It's non-scientific, it's kind of quite anecdotal, but it does illustrate how most technologies are adopted. So beginning, we have a technology trigger. We have, things become very exciting, and we peak of inflated expectations, which is probably where we are now. And then as those expectations fail to get met, we move into something called the trough of disillusionment. And that is probably the plateau, the bottom, that is the trough, before you start to climb the slope up towards the slope of enlightenment. And then finally, when things actually plateau, we get to productivity and mainstream adoption. Now, what's interesting about these curves is that they're well defined, and they happen in lots of technologies, in almost every single new sort of technology cycle. But what's most interesting about the AI one is the speed and the expectations are quite exaggerated. So that means that we will probably get very quickly to the trough of disillusionment faster than we would have with other technologies, and we will get to others in a faster rate. So as I say, I think we're probably going to go down the bottom of the inflation curve and then move down to the illusionment. It's always useful to have some quotes at this point, and I think this one from the one of the co-founders of Coursera, Andrew New, and it's got a very good point here about the fact that in some respects, if we look at previous technology enhancements, innovations, that electricity is probably a good analogy for where we are in terms of AI. And I do think that this will apply to every industry, specifically to ours in the not-for-profit space. It's always good to have another tech titan up here, but actually quite kind of a contrarian position here, which I very much agree with, and that is AI must be designed with a purpose. And I think that must be aligned to your mission, specifically if you're in the not-for-profit space, and a clear understanding of what you're trying to achieve, or else AI will just become a tool that doesn't do anything meaningful. And that's from the CEO of Microsoft, which is making major forays and enhancements in the AI space themselves. Another quote that I'm quite, very sort of take as a very impactful one is by Mustafa Suleyman, who is the author of a book called The Coming Wave, which I'm currently just busy finishing. And I was fortunate enough to attend a talk by him last week. And Mustafa's got a very interesting analogy about how throughout history, all cultures and religions revolve around major waves, and wave could be sort of things like tidal waves, etc., etc. And there's always been this kind of notion of a big wave coming, and I think that's where we are now with AI. For anyone interested, we do have a signed copy of his book to hand out, as Joyce mentioned, and we'll be presenting that prize to the person who posts the best question. The judge of that will ultimately be Carolyn. But this is a great book and a very fascinating read, very balanced in terms of its view of AI, the challenges, the risks, the concerns, but also solutions for what we should do to address them. So a great read for anyone that's interested. I thought it was useful just to set the scene and to help that point around sort of the Gartner hype cycle about how did we get here? And by comparing computing history to our artificial intelligence's own history. So we have at the top there a very, summarized line, sort of, explaining how computing really started in 1948, 47, and kind of things progressed, and first digital computers were built in the 1950s. But that rate of adoption to the point where we are now have, recollection of how long things have taken, we've moved pretty quickly from things being, online, where 1997 less than 1% of the global population were online, to where we are now, where it is a ubiquitous technology. If we compare that with artificial intelligence, it's quite surprising to see that over time, there have been significant developments in artificial intelligence that we probably didn't recognize unless you were really into this particular field or deeply into computing. And I think it illustrates that artificial intelligence itself is not necessarily a new thing. What we are looking at now, though, is generative artificial intelligence, or generative AI, which will soon become the de facto mechanism for AI. And really, when we're talking about AI, we're now talking about generative AI in the most of the contexts. ChatGPT really only been launched 2 years ago, and its inflection point on the industry has been quite massive. To illustrate that dramatic increase, if we look at information from McKinsey's global survey on AI, we can see that, it being a McKinsey report is probably focused on large enterprise global corporates, but we can see that a number of respondents were involved in AI as early as 2017. Most of this is probably BPA type stuff, but we are seeing that as time moves on, we get to 2023, and suddenly there's a huge jump with the blue bars representing generative AI. So we are seeing a really, really steep uptake and interest in this topic of AI. So I thought it was a good point to post the question to you all to see, where are you on your own AI journey?
Thank you, Alan. So yeah, I've just launched the poll. I'm going to let that run for another couple of seconds. Also to say, great, we've had some questions started coming in, so please continue on with those. Okay, so interesting. Majority of people so far are in that discovery phase. So let me just run that for 1 sec. I'm going to end the poll and let me share the results. So yeah, interesting that the vast majority of people, 52%, are at that just learning about AI and its potential, then kind of logically followed by the planning, the starting, the scaling. Nobody's saying they're advanced, which is interesting. So I'm just going to stop sharing those results. I don't know if Alan, if there was anything else you wanted to add on to that, and hand back
No,
to you.
I think it probably correlates a lot with where I was expecting things to be, and that does correlate a lot with the own AI survey that we're running as well, which we'll talk about the results in a second or two. So thank you everyone for providing your input. If we now look at kind of AI use cases in the not-for-profit sector, we've recently been running our own AI survey, and I encourage you all to please participate in that. I hope some of you have already. These are preliminary results. We haven't yet completed the survey, but I thought they'd be quite useful to share in the context of what we're looking at today. So the question is, to what extent are AI tools being used in your organization? And these are the preliminary results. And I think it's quite interesting to see that the vast majority are in the category of what we consider individual productivity. So these are probably classed as things like AI note takers, use of ChatGPT, Copilot, really assistive technologies helping individuals probably with their day-to-day productivity. These could be summarizing things, etc., etc. But then towards the right of it, we see a sharp drop in terms of the response numbers for other sort of what I'd consider more organizational-led implementations. So if we look at that, we're kind of looking at individual, and I think the best way to classify this is they're helping you do your job faster or better. But when we start looking at organizational initiatives where probably some of the sort of implementations are seeing a bit more back room, they're not being necessarily evident to absolutely everybody, but it's about the use of data insights and analytics. It's about organizational productivity where it's not just dependent on the individual, and looking at research and development of new products and services. Interesting that customer/stakeholder engagement, and I understand in the NFP sector we don't like the word customer, but I think it's the best way of summarizing the member, the donor, the volunteer, the fundraiser, the board member, etc. That actually that's at the low end, and that surprises me a little bit because I think there are some gains to be had there. But when we summarize things from the organizational perspective, I think this is probably led more by automation, and that's doing the things your organization can't do well or can't do efficiently with limited resources. And I think the limited resources chimes really strongly within our sector because we all know that the NFP space is its biggest challenge, and the thing that I think it does phenomenally well is it does a hell of a lot with very little. And so I think there's gains to be had if we think more about taking the sort of efforts that individuals are making on the AI side and look at the lessons we can learn from making that more organizationally led. I've thought of putting up some ideas here in terms of why investing in artificial intelligence. Some of these are quite high level, and I think that if we got into a deeper discussion about this, I think we'll start to see people finding lots more use cases, and that's definitely a conversation that we'd like to understand and be involved in so we can understand more about individual organizations and how they're looking at things. But I put them into 4 buckets, and I think if we look at the first one, in terms of engagement, there are great opportunities to personalize experiences. I know that my experience with membership organizations and charities as well over the years is that personalizing those experiences has always been the holy grail. It's very much data dependent, but we are starting to see that people are starting to use AI a little bit more here, not as much as I was hoping, but to see people customizing and personalizing those experiences, they can be more adaptive. Using predictive automation, trying to understand and anticipate what our members or donors might be wanting next in their customer journey, and trying to predict and serve that has major benefits, both in terms of their satisfaction of the service, but also in terms of taking the load off some of the staff in call centers and contact centers having to respond to those requests. And that's supported sometimes by the use of things like chatbots. One area that we are seeing probably a greater inclusion in this is the marketing generation of marketing content. I think there's got to be some sort of rail guards in place to protect against that, but I think that's one area where we can see individuals taking the charge, specifically in the marketing and content teams. Anyone responsible for producing content is using AI tools not to do their jobs, but to help them with ideation and content creation. Impact is really a kind of a bucket that I would use for sort of impact in terms of the service delivery. So that might be your membership offering, that might be a number of other personalized services that you're delivering to service users. And that's really about increasing its effectiveness. And I think that's an area where AI can have quite a high impact, but then also the ability to monitor and adapt in real time service offerings in terms of responding to changing times. So we know that big seismic shifts can be difficult to react to, and I think COVID probably being the most recent relevant one for us to bear in mind. But I think in using things like AI, we would probably have been able to respond a little bit faster to some of the more mundane tasks, allowing us to focus on the higher value things that our stakeholders would value. And I think actually one of the areas that I think is often missed in terms of understanding, the role of AI and staff is the ability to develop staff and services, but also to enable people with learning. And I think that's going to be the biggest area for organizations to focus on, is by enabling staff to understand large language models, understand query creation, et cetera, to be able to respond to the changing times a little bit more. I think on that point, the one thing I would say when people are concerned about, AI and the adoption of AI and staff, do remember this: the younger generation will take to this like ducks to water, and they will demand it. And so those organizations that are enabled and set up to utilize AI to enable them to do their jobs better will be more attractive than those that are not. And so that's something to bear in mind on that point. Data and insights, I think that we will see the opportunity to make better decisions through a lot more data. Obviously, AI depends on a lot of data, but if you have a lot of data, AI can help you sift through that to make better decisions. One area that I think Carolyn will probably talk to a little bit about is kind of research and development. I think if you were involved in the medical area, then this is an area where AI is having some massive impacts both on industry, but also on people's lives. And the ability to use predictive analytics to help course correct, back to that point around being able to respond to seismic shifts, I think that we'll be able to do that more effectively because we will have more data at our disposal and the tools to analyze them, and the ability to adapt automatically. Then to the final one, I think that the area will be around efficiency, and obviously the one there is potentially around cost savings. I think the risk will be balancing off the desire to save costs by reducing routine tasks that could be automated, but is balanced against making some difficult decisions potentially about where those cost savings might come from. I think that there are probably greater cost savings to be had from dependencies on third parties than there are from cutting back on staff. And I think that's going to be about making the staff complement you have more effective, more efficient, and through the use of AI, rather than cutting back and outsourcing services to AI services. I kind of don't see that happening in the near to midterm. And ultimately, really, the efficiency is about making better use of people's skills and their time. And I think that in our industry, that's probably the single biggest challenge that everyone has always had around resource utilization. So back to another poll. It would be interesting to know from yourselves, what do you think the impact of AI will be on the NFP sector?
Perfect, thank you, Alan. Yeah, so I just put the poll up. So as before, just give it a couple of seconds on that. Carolyn, just interested, while people are voting, kind of what is your sort of thinking about this, of what the impact will be?
I think it'll be evolving, but it's more of a utility. This isn't going to be a massive impact in most areas, I wouldn't have thought. And there are different tranches of AI that Alan's alluded to in his slide. And I think for the next sort of 5 to 8 years, it will have an impact, a positive impact, and an adoption as a utility in terms of efficiency more than anything else. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, perfect. Which I think, if I just end the poll and share the results, which kind of really agrees with you in the sense of, that positive, but positive but limited. That's sort of the highest percentage around that. But still a lot of people on the too early to tell camp as well. So I think that's quite interesting. So I'll hand back to you, Alan, and if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's probably quite natural. I think if we talk about big seismic shifts, I'd be disappointed to see that there was no one in the audience who was thinking it's too early to tell. And if we think about the hype curve, I think we probably are at that crescendo of expectation. So I think that's a healthy stance. But I think it's nice to see that it's quite balanced in terms of the distribution. And that will probably be quite relevant to the organizations and where they are in terms of their own digital, journeys and optimization. So moving on then, again, I thought it was probably useful just to see how that data sort of correlates with the preliminary results that we're seeing from our own AI survey. And I think that we're all seeing that probably most people believe that the sort of benefits in the use of AI are probably around those improved operational efficiencies. It's worth noting here that these were multiple response options, so people could select multiple options here. And I think if we rank them from right to left, I think we're seeing improved operational efficiencies probably be the next area where we'll see quite a lot of opportunity. And then obviously still around increased, personal productivity. And then I think, we are seeing kind of things that I would expect to see where people think, okay, if we've got those in place, then we'll probably start to see better decision making. I am a bit surprised that innovation and creativity is probably as low as it is. I think that realistically, there's opportunity for that to be probably better used and implemented in teams, and then also around sort of being able to improve the customer experience as part of that. So there'll be some things to be gained over there, and we'll probably like to see how this evolves. Do remember, please, to contribute to the survey yourselves if you haven't, and share it around so we can get a really good base to work on. Looking at some other areas, in which areas do you believe AI is most beneficial to your organization? I think this was kind of following a sort of pattern distribution that I was expecting. However, when I was looking at this a little bit more, I realized there was a bit of a correlation here in some of the information here. Again, there were multiple response answers. Technically, yes, for those statisticians in the audience, I know that you can't use a pie chart to represent numbers greater than 100%, but it was just a very useful way to visualize this. And that is that I've highlighted the sections in blue, which are probably very operationally specific to the NFP sector, whereas the ones in black, they're generic to any organization. And what I see there is that people are probably comfortable with the fundamentals of doing the day job. In terms of, you're in a membership organization or a trade union, you're comfortable that your systems are there and enabled to do that. But it actually, in the areas of the more generic things that all organizations need to address, that's probably the area where people are seeing the greatest improvement. I'd be interested to get Carolyn's take on that, in QA with her. But I thought that was just an interesting observation. Who knows, maybe things will pan out differently by the time the survey closes. Last one in the charts for now, but is what challenges do you face in becoming or being data ready for AI adoption? And I think it's quite interesting that we are seeing concerns around the high costs of upgrading systems. And that is always going to be the case, I think, in terms of a technology-led world where things are moving so fast. We are seeing the cost of AI being a prohibitive factor for getting people into this technology, but it is interesting to see that it's there. I thought very interesting was the second one, is the lack of skilled personnel. And that, I think, is the opportunity here. And I was pleased to see that the narrative isn't entirely about, oh, well, it's doom and gloom, we're worried about how, staff, etc., will perceive AI. I think that the opportunity here is to enable people in the same way that we probably, needed to enable people in the early years of the internet to understand it better, so that its use cases could be better defined, and then the opportunities can come. And I think if we focus on enabling and skilling our personnel through the use of AI, they will help drive the strategy themselves. They'll identify the opportunities because they will all be doing this. I think if we think of AI as a top-down, management layer thing only that will be done to people, I think we won't see the full benefits. And I think if we make this an organizational wide opportunity by enabling people in the organizations, I think we will see improvement. The obvious ones there are, and this question was slanted towards asking about data. I think we're probably all aware now that for AI to have its true effectiveness, it needs a large, well-defined, well-categorized set of data to work from. And over time, that data will increase. One of the interesting points around data that came up in the talk last week with Mohammed Suleiman, someone in the audience asked, at what point do you think AI will exhaust all the data that it has available to it? Because it won't necessarily be generating new data, but at what point would we actually reach the point where it's not generating any new data and it has mined all of the data to be had? Will that be the end of this journey? And it was a really interesting question. And Mohammed's kind of answer was, no, I think what will happen at that point is that data will then become ubiquitous and irrelevant to the conversation and will move into something different. And I thought that was an interesting view on it. One of the respondents, anonymous, responded with us, which I thought was an interesting point to sort of start winding down on this piece, and that is that there's this assumption in our survey that we know what AI is available, what the opportunities are. And for this particular respondent, their biggest barrier is the lack of knowledge, and why, you know, case studies and sharing of information is kind of the thing that's needed to sort of spark that little fire inside that allows people to understand the power of this technology before going into it wholeheartedly. And I think this is a really important point. It's difficult to start building a strategy for a technology that is evolving so quickly, and that is actually taken into our advice in this session. Before we hand over to Caroline, I thought it was useful just to acknowledge and to put out some of the known challenges and considerations that organizations will have to navigate if they do want to, and I think they should, extract the full value of something like AI. So there are some very well-grounded ethical concerns around responsible use. I think the word bias is going to be becoming a lot more commonplace in our lexicon of terminology, specifically around technology, because bias is a fundamental factor in utilizing AI and making sure that the machine is not making decisions based on bias. I think we have seen just in the early days a number of false steps made by the large tech companies where they were not able to fully understand the impact of bias and to mitigate it. I think that this will be addressed. I think it will go away if we're all responsible and pay attention to it. And then also ethical concerns around developing people and retaining them. Skills gap, I think that there is definitely a skills gap, as there is with any new technology. But I think as long as the hype is not kind of over evaluated and people think, oh, it's just hype, let's forget about it. I think the opportunity is to start developing people now, so that they can develop these skills and capabilities over time, so that when it's time to actually be ready with a more finished product, you are ready to roll. Cost, obviously, we've already spoken about. There are high investment costs to engaging on AI, but I think that there are also opportunities in terms of utilizing low value AI opportunities to lower costs in certain places. So I think that can be measured. I think data privacy and compliance is probably the most important aspect here, is making sure that what you're doing is secure in terms of your data, but also that you have a governance framework in place to protect sensitive data, to protect your staff, to evaluate all of these concerns and make sure that you have something in place to monitor it and to measure it and to continue adapting for it. Mission alignment, I think, is one that's quite relevant to the not-for-profit sector, and that is making sure that what you're doing isn't just hype for the sake of hype, or the use of new technologies, or back to the cartoon at the beginning, not using the hammer just because it's there and finding a use for it, but is to make sure that this is aligned to your core mission. And I think that's probably a really good place for people to start when they're looking at this. So again, I think the secret here is to establish a foundation of governance that fundamentally addresses these concerns. In the second series on AI, this is a topic that we'll be digging into. So please do join us for that. And before we kind of hand over to Carolyn and get her experience on this topic, I wanted just to remind everybody that if you haven't yet completed the survey, please do so. It'd be great to get your input on this topic.
Perfect. Thank you, Alan. So yes, Carolyn, everybody's dying to hear more about what you're actually doing. So could you, I suppose, first of all, give us a little bit of sort of background on the BMA, just in case anybody's not aware of what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Joyce. Yeah, so the BMA is, you will know, a trade union and professional service provider for our doctors in the UK. So we have 200,000 members, actually just approaching 200,000 members across all branches of practice. So its main purpose is as a trade union, but we do also provide products and services to those doctors. For example, we'll develop apps that the doctors can use in the workplace. So that's, and we do events also for doctors and learning and development programs. So there's a whole raft of other things that go alongside the trade union activities, which people will know is focused on policy, negotiation, lobbying, etc. So our AI journey, I think before I dive into this, and thanks, Alan, because I think it's really great to kind of set the scene the way you did with these slides. I didn't see all of the finished products and I followed it with interest. One of the things I think that stands out for me, and I've got to share with everybody here, this is evolving. Nobody can just say, you know, here you go, here's your AI product, and devise a strategy around it. I mean, it's a bit of a excuse me, it's a bit of a Rubik's cube. You're looking at it and thinking, well, what do I actually do with this? And particularly around the tranches of AI utilities versus AI models. And I think those are two different things. So before I dive into the sort of our journey, if you like, I think for me, there are two very distinctive areas. One is the area where we were suddenly caught as a reaction through the launch of ChatGPT, closely followed by things like Copilot as a utility to do something with in an organization, which is that kind of sort of Rubik's Cube product that's been dropped through your letterbox and you're thinking, well, what do I do with this? Versus the sort of AI models, which have really more their roots in the machine learning and history of AI evolution. And the evolution of those models are being used, Alan, you mentioned briefly there, much more pervasively and to a much greater depth in research, particularly around medical research, which the BMA supports through various grants, etc. So some of the examples in that particular area would be around the accuracy of diagnostics through imaging, etc. I mean, there's a whole raft of things that researchers are doing where they're using the more advanced models that are out on available to them, plus developing their own. So if you bring the whole thing back to the workplace and I look at the journey that the BMA has been on, then I will go back to using the sort of ChatGPT Copilot utility aspect of it, because that is the thing that has the greatest visibility. And for us, like everybody else, when ChatGPT was suddenly launched as a large language model, generative AI, these are new words, labels. People were looking it up, thinking, well, what does this actually mean? Beginning to understand that, you know, your human input in standard text could generate vast responses. And suddenly it was a bit of a sort of a crash bang into an organization where we were also challenged to say, well, hang on a minute, if everybody goes off and uses ChatGPT, what impact does that have on us as an organization if our employees go out and use it? We had a case where not long after launch of ChatGPT, people were, for example, putting something out onto ChatGPT, which was private and confidential. to the BMA. So our response, we were already devising one, was the AI use policy, and we started then accelerating, rather as a reaction to everything, a use policy for the secure use of ChatGPT that exists in the public domain. So really the guidance that by now most people will have in place was the use policy, and we followed that up with blogs and learning, and it was very much a reaction at that point. But it did give us an opportunity to start turning the tide of it and evolving our own strategy. It wasn't one of writing something down to say, we will do X, Y, Z by such and such a time. It was an evolving theme of usage through our understanding of those tools that were coming into the market. So one of the things that followed closely from the ChatGPT and AI internal use policy was a program of learning and blogs internally for our staff and our members. And we immediately communicated with the board as well to say, look, we're going to be on top of this. We're going to have a very slow approach. We're going to learn. We'll keep you updated. The board wanted a regular update on our approach to it. The Audit and Risk Committee wanted to be involved. As a union, there was an immediate response from the people side. How is this going to affect us if we have tools that suddenly can take over jobs, etc. So one of the first things that we did after the co-pilot was then introduced last year was we took our senior executive to a Microsoft briefing in Paddington, and they did a very customized briefing on what co-pilot in particular and AI as it was being touted actually means. And they did, obviously there was an element of sell, but it was a very managed and cautious selling, very much the way that Satya Nadella does it, because I think he does approach it in a very cautious way. So we had an executive briefing, and it meant that our senior leadership team came back well informed of what these tools can do. And I think that kind of sets the scene very carefully and cautiously. We were then able to start building out a program of delivery against our AI co-pilot tools in particular. And we were very cautious to make sure that we referred to them, similar to your slide earlier, Alan, as a utility. These are tools that are utilities first and foremost. Co-pilot itself, of course, there are models that go beyond that. So we're very cautious in the language that we were using. We devised, put together an AI charter, which was an adoption charter, which the executive owns, and it basically spells out our responsibility as an organization to the safe use of AI, looking for or understanding risks as well as opportunities. And throughout this whole time, we were continuing to run awareness campaigns. We set up communities of practice, so particularly interested parties could participate in that rollout as well. Then more practically, what we did was we involved a partner to help us with the program itself. Now, Microsoft have got a fairly managed program of AI co-pilot adoption. And the first step in that, as per your slide just previously, is understand your environment in terms of governance and information security. Because if you use something like Copilot, albeit that it exists within the boundaries of your own organizational domain only, you have to be aware of information that you possibly surface if it doesn't have the right levels of information governance and access around it. So There are tools, assessment tools that are run in order to see how mature you are. We did that. We got a report. We've actioned the report. We nominated, or we had nominated for us, champions across the organization who wanted to be part of initial use cases for AI. These people then put use cases together. We had another session which allowed Microsoft to demonstrate how those use cases could be addressed through the use of the utilities. I call them utility co-pilots. And people went away understanding it better. Now, underpinning all of this was also the financials, understanding what the investment in the license models were, creating business cases for sign-off to make sure that the organization was wanting to invest in this. And we are now at a point where we have devised a whole program of learning and license allocations. So in other words, we don't allocate a co-pilot license unless somebody has gone through the learning around the ethical use of AI, the learning around how AI tools can be used sensibly, because there is also there's also the possibility that people don't use them properly because they're not, you know, in some cases they're not that smart. I mean, particularly if you use them within Excel, they don't do all the singing and dancing yet, and that's still evolving. In other areas, they do good stuff and really good stuff, but you have to keep an eye on it. It is an augmentation of a process in terms of its kind of efficiency gain. And Microsoft do tout through their initial co-pilot user group, which I think they ran for about a year with various large organizations. They have a calculation model which says that we would have a 10-month payback on our return on investment for just 300 licenses, just because of the efficiency gains that they have mapped. Now, they do have a tool called Viva Insight. It's existed within the Microsoft stack or offering for quite a while, but they've allowed the license usage to be measured there as well. So you do have a way in which you can kind of measure who's using what at what point. Brilliant. So I think that's an important bit.
No, absolutely. And I'm just conscious because we have lots of questions coming in that I want to make sure, Carolyn, we've sure. got time to move on to. Because you have touched on some of the challenges already, which I think is really great. But I suppose if you had to pick one main challenge that you had in this entire process, I mean, you've put in some great process in making sure that people are learning, what would that be?
I'm going to take the liberty to give you two answers to that. One is the technical challenge around the information governance, and the second one is the ethical one.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, perfect. That makes sense. And I think we can expand on that on some of the questions that are coming in. So I'm just going to hand back to you, Alan, for a second, and then we'll move on to Q&A.
Great, thanks, Joyce. I'm just going to make sure we're back to sharing screen, and great. That doesn't seem to be sharing. Is everyone seeing any sharing there? It looks like I'm sharing, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything. Let's try that again.
The technology, it doesn't want to cooperate.
Yeah, we couldn't afford the AI tool for Zoom.
AI knows we're talking about it, so it doesn't want to cooperate.
I think this may have been one of those situations where I may have gotten a bit too carried away. So I think what we'll do is just close that down. Right. Yeah, and we have sharing back. Great. So thanks for that, Carol. I think there's some areas here that I wanted to sort of build on, which align a lot with what you were probably saying. For some of you who will have seen this before on a previous talk that we did around data, I thought this was still relevant, and it's kind of a reuse of Maslow's hierarchy, and it's kind of our view of, where do you sit in sort of your technology maturity and your digital maturity? So we have a functional sort of foundation layer, secure, where your data is actually secure. You know what management tools you have in place. You have defined processes and capability for transacting digitally and taking payment. And then as you move up, you can be integrated, where you've got, you're breaking down silos and your data is kind of consolidated and you know where it is. And most important, your users feel enabled by data. And then you start to make intelligent decisions from your data. You may be using things like data warehouses at this point, or you're using personalization and automation in your CMS because it's integrated to your CRM, and you're starting to look at continuous improvement. The holy grail is really when you get to that optimized sort of piece where you start using AI and predictive analytics. And I think the point that I wanted to make with this is that at some point you're going to need a data strategy, which is pretty functional down at the bottom there, is you kind of need to start thinking about it there. And then at a point, as you go higher up, you are going to need an AI strategy before you get to the optimized space. The reality is that I think that we're starting to see the need for an AI strategy even as you start to move from the integrated to intelligent space. And I think that's predominantly because we're seeing a lot of AI being embedded in tools that you're currently using. And you do need to be conscious of that, because a lot of the technology platforms out there are auto-enabling AI, and you almost have to be prepared to turn it off to then evaluate whether you have an AI strategy in place, that your governance is place, and then turn it back on. Simple little things, and Carolyn alluded to this, is putting sensitive information into something like ChatGPT without making sure that the guardrails are in place can mean that your sensitive information or your proprietary information is inside that LLM. An example of this is the early days of ChatGPT. Samsung's own mobile phone developers were taking production code and putting it into ChatGPT to clean up the code. So if you've got developers, they obviously want to optimize their code, and ChatGPT is great for doing that. But what they failed to realize, they were actually taking parts of Samsung's IP and putting it into the large language model. Now, they managed to address that by going back to ChatGPT and saying, hey, guys, we made a mistake. That's useful if you're a large corporate the size of Samsung, but probably difficult for organizations in our normal space. So please do make sure that you've got your processes and you've got your strategies in place before you go into these things, because the guardrails do need to be there. Looking a little bit further forward, we've kind of created some tips for developing your AI strategy. Understand your organizational goals. Do not start this process if you don't know what those are. Then assess your AI readiness and your capabilities. That's not doing things, that's just looking at it and saying, do I have people trained? Do I have tools? Do I have partners? Kind of along the lines of what Carolyn was talking about. And then start to prioritize. What's the highest value use cases for your AI initiative? We'll talk about that next. And then start developing that governance and ethical framework. And this will need to evolve as the tools and your use of the tools evolve. You will need to keep coming back to this framework and reevaluating it. Definitely develop a communications and training plans that everybody can be brought along. Ensure that your stakeholders are engaged, and that's about transparency and telling people, if they are members, donors, volunteers, fundraisers, that you are using AI in certain cases so that they understand, and that sense of transparency will help hedge off any kind of concerns that they may have. Develop a proof of concept. This is really the nucleus of what we wanted to get across today. The AI topic is going to evolve so quickly and so dramatically over time that a big bang approach will not work. So you do need to define a proof of concept to start getting your kind of AI feet wet, to start learning how things go. And then you can review the insights that proof of concept generates, and then you audit, adapt, and repeat, and then you can probably scale from there. But absolutely do go down the route of a proof of concept. That is where the value is at the moment. How do you pick the best place to pick an AI concept, proof of concept? We've kind of reused this grid, which has got impact and demand on the y-axis and complexity on the x-axis, which is also risk, and sort of putting them into low and low, high, low, and low, high quadrants. We'd suggest that, if you've got the low end side of things, This is kind of what I'd consider sandbox. Social media posts, internal content, kind of whimsical applications, things like memes, etc. Low risk, low impact, low complexity. Moving up into the higher impact, low risk category is productivity gains. Personal productivity, Carolyn mentioned Excel. I use ChatGPT to do a lot of Excel computational stuff that I'm just not smart enough to do myself. Does that mean I shouldn't be running Hart Square? Probably. Speak to my staff afterwards. But actually what it illustrates is it's helping me do my job faster and better without me having to go on an Excel course that I'll probably not have the mental aptitude to stick through. So those are great opportunities to gain. I think marketing, we are seeing people use marketing. I think there's great opportunities there around learning. Things like code QA, I've included this as an opportunity. You know, getting things tidied up with code. Do think about the guardrails. Ideation. You know, some of the content for this, we know what we want to say, but we're not quite sure exactly how far to go. So we put it into ChatGPT and we ask, what else could we think about in terms of this topic? And it gives us an idea, and we then follow that thread. I think that's a healthy process to follow. And then business insights. As you move up into terms of the risk factor, you do start to get into things like business intelligence, you know, meeting regulatory compliance, possibly technical publishing. If you've got sort of like the BMA do, you could start to use these things to take the heavy lifting out of some of these difficult topics, but they do increase the risk. And then at the bottom, kind of the specialist areas, you know, an example here being medical diagnosis. So yes, you know, if you are in the medical space, there are some opportunities to be had, but they increase risk. Now, my suggestion here is you've probably started in the sandbox. Where do you go next? For your AI proof of concept, focus on the productivity box in terms of the ones that are the highest impact for the lowest risk, and then move to delivery. And then last, you probably want to move down to specialist. And I think the trick here is identify the highest value area for the lowest risk. Avoid creating a big bang project. It's just not what this is defined for. So in terms of defining your AI project, some quick tips here. Create the governance framework. Ensure that you do have those well-defined goals. Make sure that they're smart things that you can measure, and that you can make sure they're realistic and they're time-based, etc. AI should address a weakness, not create one, and make sure that that's defined in your goal strategy. Then assess your capabilities. Make sure that you understand all the resources you have, both human and technical. And then moving into sort of evaluating tools, which I think Carolyn's spoken about there, using Microsoft as an example. There are other vendors available. Lots of them are capable and growing in this space. Implement your prototype. Make sure that you can start and scale it up as you go. And then review so that you can take the lessons learned and move on from there. And then before we kind of close it off, I thought just some sort of final tips to kind of give you some sort of guidance here. And I think establishing an AI strategy is an iterative process. Definitely avoid a big bang. Be prepared to make some mistakes. Make sure that those mistakes are mitigated against your governance framework. Things will evolve dramatically over time and over the next few years. So measure that against your kind of investment cycle, and ensure that you have governance framework in place before you start. Don't start and then think, oh, well, actually, we probably should have plugged those gaps. It might be too late. But in amongst all of this, don't sit on the sidelines. The journey is the destination. So if you're wondering, should we just hold back and not do anything? I think that the value here is actually taking your first few steps in AI. So over to the QA section now. Joyce, over to you.
So we've lots of questions. We won't get through them all. We will answer them offline afterwards. But one, Caroline, I particularly want to ask you was around so the question is, what frameworks or models can non-for-profits adopt to implement AI responsibly and effectively in their operations? So I suppose for you, was there any framework for you to follow, or you've had to develop it yourself?
No, I mean, we're a Microsoft house, so we use their adoption model, and it very much follows the path of similar to what Alan's just put up there as the sort of generic stepping stone. It's make sure that you get your house in order. If you're looking at it from a technical point of view, make sure that you've got your information governance in place, and there are various ways in which you can do that. Just quite simply, if you don't do that, then everything else falls flat on its face. You need to make sure that that's in place, and then you start building up on that. So there are adoptions, guidelines around communication with the rest of the organization, which is important. learning and development as you're going through, because it's not just a case of giving somebody a license and then it can be used. It's, you know, you have to also kind of understand what it's doing and how it's learning. So there are sort of iterative steps, and all of that information, certainly for Microsoft, as it will be for other providers, are very much out there as given material that you can easily draw down.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And then another question, it's a long question, but then I'll kind of summarize the part I want you to cover. So as an organization in the not-for-profit sector, especially for those of us with charitable purposes to work towards improving society, how do we balance the benefits of using AI with the negative environmental impacts we're becoming aware of the use it has? I suppose when you've been looking at, you know, your AI strategy, has environmental impact or anything like that been a consideration or not, or sort of, you know, what has thinking been on that?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I mean the environmental impact of AI is very much, I presume, in this, and the person asking the question can clarify, is around the greater amount of processing that's required in order to generate output. And I think that's a very good question to pose, because as the world, you know, moves ever closer to, you know, more high-powered, more data processing, the environmental impact increases exponentially, and we're kind of, you know, flying a bit blind in all of this, thinking that it doesn't concern us. It does concern us. What I would say on the other side of that is that AI has an opportunity to be used, and is being used, in lots of industries where environmental impact can be very positively affected. So I think you need to have a balanced approach against that sort of energy consumption awareness, which is real, and the environmental side of the software itself, if you like, the intelligence itself that can be used to help globally in environmental context.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just there was some other questions about specific types of AIs and tools that are available, which I know Alan has touched on a bit already. So, and again, we can pick them up afterwards. And then just one last question, I think, Carolyn, at this stage, so it's a long one. AI utilities have been quickly embedded into data analytics platforms such as Google Analytics, Tableau, Power BI. How do you think this will support better, more accurate data storytelling? And what strategies can be put in place to mitigate biases in AI algorithms and promote equitable representation in data storytelling? So in summary, using AI for better data storytelling, is that something you've been considering?
Yes, and no, I understand the question. Look, I mean, tools like sort of Power BI, etc., they in principle, you know, they can attach themselves to any source of data that you want them to attach to. And if you couple them with the utility of AI, you can build out the extensibility part of the AI Copilot, for example, within Power BI, to be a lot more intelligent in search and retrieval. So your queries, your algorithms that you're building out with far more ease, I dare say, than previously existed, will give you different cuts of data and therefore different storytelling. But obviously the end user still has to be there to say, well, what is it that I want to be telling a story about? And you start at that point and then work your way back.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant.
And we have started to do some of that, and it works very well within Power BI.
Perfect, thank you. So just conscious of time, so as I say, we will come back and answer any of the outstanding questions after the session. So now I'm going to hand back to Alan just to summarise.
Thanks, Joyce. Just getting the sharing back. Go. So yes, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Specifically, very big thank you to Carolyn for her advice and time and input on this topic. I think it's hugely pleasing to see an organisation like the BMA under the guidance of Carolyn taking the steps that they are. And I think there's some huge lessons to be learned there from Carolyn and the BMA on their journey. So, you know, thank you very much to her for participating in today. Just to throw up, we do have another 2 of these AI focused in our AI series, the next one being the 21st of November, and that is focused on governance ethical considerations. A few people did ask questions about samples. We will be covering that topic around policies specifically, but do email me if you do need something in the short term and we can provide you with a sample. Policy, do bear in mind they should be adapted to your organization's goals and missions, etc. So that said, and just kind of in wrapping it up, I thought this was kind of a useful quote, which is from one of the co-founders of DeepMind, which is really one of the early adopters of this. And that is, AI is going to be a revolutionary thing, and it's going to be as impactful as energy or the steam engine, if not more. So we do need to harness this great capability and power. So thank you again very much for joining us this morning. Please do look out for the post-event survey, which will be coming out in the email shortly from us. That will have the links to the recording, the link to the post-event survey, and also do please check out our other events via the QR code or via our hub, which is available on our website. So thanks again for everybody for joining us. Appreciate your time this morning.